Greetings, Rob Chassner here, continuing in our study of the minor prophets. And today we're going to go over the prophet Amos, chapter 1. So if you're following along, Amos chapter 1. Amos is likely one of the earliest writings in the Old Testament prophets. We don't know exactly the dates, but we do know that it was one of the earlier prophets in history. We have an understanding that his primary focus is on the 10 northern tribes of Israel. You remember after the death of King Solomon that the 10 tribes of the north didn't like all their tax money modernizing Jerusalem, and so they withdrew from that system, government system, and made their own. They retained the name of Israel, and they were governed out of the city of Samaria, and then the 2 southern tribes stayed out of Jerusalem as a separate entity. If you look on the map of Israel during this period in history, it would look pretty much the same as it looks today. You would see Israel surrounded by enemies. Down in the Gaza Strip, you have the Philistines, you had the Phoenicians in the northwest, and then coming around in a clockwise position or motion, you'd have Syria, Ammon, and Moab, and Edom completely surrounding the nation of Israel. Amos is going to have something to say to the nation of Israel, but before he does, he has something to say to the enemies of God's people. His message seems to be a little bit ill-timed, that during this time in history, you had 2 very powerful kings reigning, one in the north and one in the south of Israel. The southern kingdom, you had King Uzziah out of Jerusalem, and he reigned for 52 years. He was a beloved and great king. He followed God, but toward the end of his life, he made some really tragic decisions and mistakes, and we often see that with very successful people. But Uzziah did not finish strong because of his pride, and he was a great king, but he did not finish strong. The northern kingdom, you had Jeroboam the second, and understand that each of the kings of the northern tribes, they were all horrible people. They were horrible kings, but all of those kings, even though they were awful, Jeroboam the second was the worst of all of them. And so what that spelled is that Israel began to take the borders of their nation back to what it originally was when King David was reigning. Jeroboam of the north had political and economic power over Syria, Ammon, and Moab, and Phoenicia, and the southern kingdom had political and economic power over Edom and the Philistines. And so this was a great time of prosperity, and human nature says when things are going well, they're thinking, well, God must really be smiling upon me. When everything is going well, and you have prosperity, you have good health, and things are going well, we just instinctively think, well, somehow God is smiling upon us, and I must be living right. Conversely, when things bottom out, our health declines, or maybe we have lost someone to death, or our expenses become a challenge, we instinctively think that God is angry at us, and somehow we may have violated the ways of God, and God is trying to get my attention. Now, that might be true, but it's not true in all cases. Understand that the northern tribes are up to their eyeballs in prosperity. They have never been so wealthy. They have never been so powerful, and yet God is going to destroy them in less than 50 years, according to these scriptures. And, of course, our history proves that this happened. And so now we have this prophet Amos coming out of the scene. He's got a real difficult sales job here because, how do you prepare to tell these people that they're going to be judged while at the same time they're thinking, well, all is well, all is prosperous, and God must be really shining upon me. So Amos is facing a real strong argument here with the northern tribes of Israel. And we find out that everything Amos says about these northern tribes happens exactly as he prophesies. So let's take a look at verse 1. The words of Amos, who was among the sheep breeders of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. Now, I enunciated the earthquake for a reason. We'll cover that in a minute. Amos is a man who comes from a very humble lifestyle. He's a man who originates from a very unsophisticated part of Israel. We're told that he comes from Tekoa. Now, Tekoa is up in the Judean wilderness. It's several miles south of Jerusalem, in a very barren place. And back in the time, it was typically a place given to shepherding of sheep. Notice that Amos tells us that he was a herdsman. Now, that's an interesting term in Hebrew. He could have just used the word shepherd, but that would give the impression that he was among God's leading people or God's leaders, like Jesus was a good shepherd. The idea of shepherding God's flock or God's people, it would lend itself to the thought that maybe he was a leader among God's people. There in Tekoa, but not so. The word that was used originally in Hebrew that says herdsman, it clearly shows that Amos was an owner, a raiser, and a caregiver of sheep. And so, you might look at him kind of like a modern-day hillbilly. So Amos was a very simple guy, but he was called by God, and that's the only thing that matters in our calling up by God. So when we get to they get a tap on our shoulder by God, or you get the voice in your head that says you need to be doing something, and then you have these human nature thoughts that come in and say, well, I'm not qualified, I'm not educated, I'm not experienced enough to take care of this calling that God has given. And if that happens, think about this prophet Amos. He had no experience, he was a simple guy, and when God commissions you, that's all the authority which you need. Isn't it interesting that Amos says, these are the words that he saw. He doesn't say, these are the words that I heard. He saw the words. And what does that look like? It's not like he was out taking care of his sheep and he encountered something like Moses did with the burning bush. Amos makes mention later in the prophecies that he saw visions, and it would appear that that is what he's saying here, what we're reading. He saw a vision, and then he wrote it down so you and I could read about it. Notice that he is dating this 2 years before the earthquake. The reference to the earthquake, notice that the word the is a definite article in the grammar. It says the earthquake, not an earthquake. What does that mean? Well, this earthquake is mentioned in the book of Zechariah. Zechariah chapter 14, verse 5, which says, you will flee by the mountain valley, for it will extend to Hazael. You will flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. All right, and so there was obviously a major earthquake during the reign of Uzziah that were introduced here in verse 1. Now Josephus, who is a first century historian, gives us some very interesting commentary about this earthquake, because you remember what happened to Uzziah. He was prideful. He thought of himself not only as the king, but he wanted to go into the holy of holy places in the temple and become a priest, and that was prohibited by the Bible, by the Pentateuch, the Torah. And so Josephus tells us in this, let's see, what happened was there was a great earthquake, and the sun came through and tore open the temple, and God placed leprosy right on his forehead, and he lived the remaining portion of his life in isolation. So Josephus tells us that in the meantime, a great earthquake shook the ground. Rent was made in the temple. Rent is an archaic term, rent in twain, ripped in half. And the bright rays of the sun shone through it, and it fell upon the king's face, inasmuch as leprosy seized upon him immediately. And so Josephus is telling us that there was a massive earthquake that took place when Uzziah took it upon himself to go into the Holy of Holies to burn incense rather than giving the priest the job to do it. This is an action, again, that was prohibited in the Torah. The earthquake broke open the temple, and leprosy was laid upon the face of Uzziah. So we read about what we're reading and studying. This took place 2 years before the earthquake. What we're reading about here in Amos. Amos had a very short ministry, so we can see that everything was done and finished within a 2-year period of time. Amos was in the public eye for about 2 years. All right, verse 2, and he said, the Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds mourn, and the top of Carmel withers. Now, Carmel is up there in the northwestern part of Israel, Mount Carmel. It's on the Mediterranean coast. Carmel is the highest content of forestry. They get over 30 inches of rain per year there. It's a very lush part of Israel. And so you can see, as part of this prophecy, it says your best, okay, this lush forest is going to wither. Now, you know that you're in trouble when the very best that you have withers away. That is the prophecy. The very best land, the very best agriculture is going to be withered to nothing. Now notice as we move on what Amos is going to do before he prophesies to the northern tribes of Israel. He's going to, each of the enemies of God's people, he is going to describe who he is prophesying against, and then he's going to say why he's against them, why God is against them. All right, verse 3, thus say the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Damascus and for 4, I will not turn away its punishment, because they have threshed Gilead with implements of iron. All right, so notice this phrase, for 3 transgressions and for 4. We will see this repeatedly throughout the book of Amos. This is a form of Hebraic poetry. You remember, as Solomon said in Proverbs chapter 6, verse 16, there are 6 things which the Lord hates, yes, 7 which are an abomination to him. It is a poetic way in the Hebrew language to emphasize something like the icing on the cake, or the straw that broke the camel's back. It's a Hebraic colloquialism. You messed up 3 times, now it's the 4th time you're really going to get your head handed to you, so to speak. All right, so that's what it means, and you're going to see this repeated now. Verses 4 and 5, but I will send a fire into the house of Hazael, which shall devour the palaces of Ben-Hadad. I will also break the gate bar of Damascus and cut off the inhabitant from the valley of Avon. And the one who holds the scepter of Beth Eden, the people of Syria shall go captive to Kir, says the Lord. Now Hazael means God has seen. Hazael was the king ruler over Damascus, and Ben-Hadad, son of Hadad, Ben-Hadad means son of Hadad. Also, the meaning of that word is like a blacksmith. Ben-Hadad was their former king. Hazael was the former king, and then the son became the king. Amos started up in the northeast corner of Israel's enemy, Syria, in Damascus, and essentially Amos is pointing out who is on God's hit list, and then he points out why these people find themselves on God's hit list. And so first on God's hit list is Damascus. And notice the reason is due to Syria's incredible cruelty. They were barbaric in the ways in which they would kill God's people. And isn't it interesting that in modern days we still find stories on the headlines in the news about Damascus, and they're still barbaric, they're still animalistic, they're still cruel to this day. And so what Amos is pointing out here, when Syria would attack God's people, they would kill them wholesale with farming instruments like threshers or combines. They would just trample groups of people with machinery, and they would. It's like throwing people in a food grinder, so to speak, or a wood chipper. Totally barbaric warfare, and God is saying to them, because of their barbaric warfare, God will see to it these people come to an end. All right, verses 6, 7, and 8 say, Thus say the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Gaza and for 4, I will not turn away its punishment, because they took captive the whole captivity to deliver them up to Edom. But I will send a fire upon the wall of Gaza, which shall devour its palaces. I will cut off the inhabitant of Ashdod, and the one who holds the scepter of Ashkelon. I will turn my hand against Ekron, and the remnant of the Philistines shall perish, says the Lord God. And so now Amos goes down into an area that we're all familiar with called the Gaza Strip, which runs along the Mediterranean Sea. And that is where the Philistines had their stronghold. Now, why is God going to judge them? Notice once again, it's due to their cruelty. And notice the emphasis here. They carried away the whole. There's no sparing. There's no mercy. They didn't allow anyone off the hook. They just went in and they spoiled the entire people of God wholesale. And what they were involved with was human trafficking. They went into villages. They went into cities, and the Lord's people, and they would not spare one person. No grace, no mercy at all. It was purely wholesale destruction, and these people would carry off and put them into slavery. They'd put them into the sex trade. And imagine what kind of a cruel thing that would be to bear as a parent or a grandparent. This was a barbaric act of warfare, and God is saying, I see human trafficking, and I'm going to deal with this. There is the same thing going on today in many parts of the world, and God knows who those people are, and they are going to be put on God's hit list, and God will deal with them, and they can just count on judgment to come. Verses 9 and 10, Thus say the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Tyre, and for 4 I will not turn away its punishment, because they delivered up to the whole captivity of Edom, and did not remember the covenant of brotherhood. But I will send a fire upon the wall of Tyre, which shall devour its palaces. All right, so they too were trafficking in human beings. They had no grace or mercy for God's people. Notice again, the emphasis is on the whole. They would come into a city and no one would be spared, men, women, and children alike. They wiped all of the Israeli towns and villages out. And notice that God says through Amos, they did not remember their brotherly covenant. Well, what do they mean? What does that mean? You remember King David wanted to build the temple, and God told David, you're a man of war, you have blood on your hands, and this temple is a temple or a house of peace, and it's a place where man can find peace between himself and his maker. I cannot allow hands with blood on them to build this house of peace. And so what did David do? He began to prefabricate the temple, and he struck a deal with Hiram, who was the king of Phoenicia. Tyre was the major city in Phoenicia, and they had this brotherly relationship. David would send his labor forces to Phoenicia, and they would bring back raw materials from Phoenicia. They had these massive cedars. They call them cedars of Lebanon, cedars that they would use in the temple, and they had forgotten about this close relationship. Now, we have talked about Damascus. We've talked about Tyre doing human trafficking. Now, who were they selling God's people to? They were selling them to Edom. And so we see Edom is now on the hit list. Edom is buying these people. So they're a party to the human trafficking. And so now they too will be judged. Verses 11 and 12, thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Edom, and for 4 I will not turn away its punishment, because he pursued his brother with the sword, and cast off all pity. His anger tore perpetually, and he kept his wrath forever. But I will send a fire upon Teman, which shall devour the palaces of Basra. All right, so if you looked at a map of this region, you will see that Amos starts in the northeast. He crosses completely across Israel to the southwest. Then he goes to the coast of Tyre in the northwest coast, and then he's going down to the southeast region of Edom. So notice it says, you chased your brother with the sword. Well, who were the Edomites? The Edomites were descendants of Esau. Who was Esau's brother? Jacob. Who was Esau and Jacob? They were sons of Isaac, one of the, and so Jacob was the patriarch of Israel. Remember, he had 12 sons, and they were all named the 12 patriarchs of Israel. So Jacob was the father. Esau was the uncle of the 12 patriarchs, or the brother of Jacob. And so the Edomites were family. They were cousins to Israel. Now, why were they so abusive to their family? Notice that several times Amos makes reference to anger. The Edomites had an anger issue. They became they came by their anger honestly, because Esau was an angry man. Esau was very ill-tempered, and now you find his descendants are very ill-tempered, and the anger destroyed their family relationship. Now, how many of us can say that we have seen family relationships destroyed due to ill temper or anger? You show me an angry person, and I'm going to show you a person that is filled with pride. Anger is rooted in pride. I should have had a better job. I should have had a better life. I should have had a better car, a better house than I have already. When you start to think more highly of yourself than you ought to be thinking, you get ticked off at things because you feel entitlement to better things, and that makes you angry. Pride produces anger. So don't forget one of the famous verses in the Bible, Proverbs 16:18, which says, pride comes before the fall. These people, the Edomites, are angry about the fact that they should have had the promised land, and our great old grandpa was ripped off by his brother Jacob, and now they're not letting go of that. And so that is what the Lord said. You have got this rage, you've got this wrath, which you are holding on to. The anger has destroyed their lives. So is God important enough in your life for you to control your anger? When you feel rage or blood pressure rising, is God important enough in your lives to cut the anger off, or to cut, to do the calling of God? When we get angry, we're offending God. The Edomites were angry. They were offending God, and then God put them on his hit list. Set aside your self-centered behavior, your self-righteous pride, your anger, because if you don't, you're going to be put on God's hit list. The Edomites were angry people, and that anger opened the door to God's judgment. All right, so verses 13 through 15 say, thus saith the Lord, I used King James, thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of the people of Ammon, and for 4 I will not turn away its punishment, because they ripped open the woman with a child in Gilead, that they might enlarge their territory. But I will kindle a fire of the wall of Rabbah, and it shall devour its palaces amid shouting in the day of battle, and a tempest in the day of the whirlwind. Their king shall go into captivity, he and his princes together, says the Lord. Now notice that God not only sees the cruelty that happens to human beings that are alive, he also bears witness to the cruelty of those who are yet to be born. And this nation was going to suffer because of the cruelty of the unborn. You've got to be thinking, after saying that, how far away is America from the destructive hand of God? We have now aborted nearly 60 million Americans since Roe versus Wade in 1973. And if you want to know why that the United States has $100 trillion in unfunded liabilities as a nation, you know, you got to, America doesn't sell automobiles like we used to. The mortgage industry, why is it we don't sell automobiles? Why is it our mortgage industry has crashed? Why is Social Security Administration bankrupt? Why is Medicare bankrupt? You have to be asking yourself. It's because, as a nation, we destroyed nearly 60 million Americans before they were born. And in fact, one out of two people, let me rephrase that. For those who are alive today that are age 30 and under, that represents 1/2 of the population that was to be, according to God's will. But 60 million have been aborted. They didn't make it out of the womb alive. God sees these things. God notices, and God's going to judge the nation of Ammon. He's for the destruction of the unborn. You can count on America being judged by God because of the nearly 60 million unborn babies that have been aborted. You just stop and think about it for a second. If those 60 million were not aborted, how much more tax revenue would there have been for those 60 million lives that were out and being productive in society today? Would we have had that national debt of the trillions of dollars? Would we have had the mortgage and real estate industry crashing? All right. Well, that's a question you can ponder. One of the great things that Amos does for you and me here, he lets us know what is it that upsets God. There are many things that get you and me mad, many things that get you and me ticked off or upset about, and there are many things which upset us that have to do with our family upbringing, our culture, the way we were raised. And oftentimes you can be angry about things which does not anger God, because God is not influenced by your family upbringing or by your culture. So as we go through chapter 1, what is important to God? You can see what's important. Mercy is important. Absence of cruelty is important. The sanctity of life is important. Unborn children are important. Not being dominated by anger is important. Giving your fellow man a break. Grace is important. Unconditional love is important to God. And being compassionate is important to God. So when is the last time that you gave grace and mercy, compassion, unconditional love to your brothers and sisters and friends and neighbors and enemies? Yes, enemies. These are the things which are on the list of values of God. And remember, these are not emotions. All of these are action words. Is your value system like God's value system? Does it break your heart to see the same things that which breaks God's heart? So perhaps you can pray to God to grant you mercy, to grant you more grace, to grant you more compassion, to grant you more sanctity in life, and to grant you unconditional love for your fellow man. All right, amen to that. I hope this has been helpful and informative. Our next study is going to be Amos chapters 2 and 3. Thank you for viewing.